China stands divided, butchered and divvied up by the global empires of the 19th century. One of the oldest civilizations on Earth will make one final war, a war upon itself and all the world. Armed with only their two fists, the people of China will rise up against the Qing dynasty and with it against the West. For 55 days, they will hold the greatest powers of the world in terror at Beijing. Destined to rise and doomed to fall, it is the story of a people pushed too far, the story of an ancient dynasty on the brink of collapse, the story of international cooperation in a pre-modern world. This is the Boxer Rebellion, and this is its story. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another Historical Humans podcast. We are coming back from the break, and we're coming back swinging. Quite literally in the Boxer Rebellion, which isn't quite the fist boxers like we're joking about. But my name is Justin Woods, and I'm joined today by my fellow co-host, Colum Coleman. And like our former episode, H.H. Holmes, Aaron is still in captivity of the Pinkertons, rest in pieces. And today we are going to jump back to China, and we are going to be talking about our favorite dynasty of all, the Qing dynasty, which this is one of its greatest, rise up and flares, because they took a movement of the people, had a government backing it, and they challenged the West, a group of isolationists.
Yep.
Ooh, you got my blood going with this one. I love when we rise up against the West.
Yeah, this is a very fun story here. It's got a very interesting sort of origin. So officially, the Boxer Rebellion is a Chinese peasant uprising from sometime in the year 1900 until September of 1901. However, it was engaged in organized violence as early as 1898. And this is because it is both a rebellion against and an organization supported by the Chinese government. The Qing dynasty that rules China at this time, it really doesn't like the Boxers, but it hates the Western powers more. And so there's this bit of back and forth between the Boxers, who kind of want to overthrow the Qing and kick out the foreigners, and the Qing, who want to put down the Boxers and kick out the foreigners. And there's a little bit of, what was it, odd bedfellows sort of situation going on here. Because the Boxer Rebellion is headed by the Yehequan, which is the righteous and harmonious fists. And they get the name Boxer from the Westerners they're fighting. Because to a lot of Westerners at this time, there is no such thing as a cultural lens. And so the Kung Fu martial art mastery that the Yehequan are dedicated to looks like a weird form of boxing to all these Western powers. So they just call them the Boxers because, God forbid, you name it right.
You're telling me that this whole episode is just white peopleism. Oh my God.
It is entirely Europe and America just whitewashing a major part of Chinese culture for the purposes of translating it into something the Westerners could understand.
Thanks, I really fucking hate it.
I know. It gets worse.
I don't like how you say that. I really don't like how you say that.
Because they are initially a Chinese secret society, like the Illuminati. And their official goal is the restoration of traditional China, traditional ways of life, traditional religion, social classes. These people are the alt-right trads of the Chinese population at this time.
Interesting.
And they have as their number one goal the total expulsion and elimination of all Western people, religion, cultural objects, and practices from Chinese territory. And they're actually almost justified in this view because this radical, pure, manifested hatred is the result of 60 years of systematic abuse.
I mean, we very much haven't even talked about the whole opium wars or the second opium wars or just the fact that every Western nation known to man had attempted to open China to trade by very forcible measures. And when you do that, I don't know if you're aware, but when you try to force yourself to into an area or onto someone, they tend not to really be a big fan. And that was very much the case here in China and has led to a lot of political instability in the modern day.
Yep. And the first Opium War ended in 1842, and it is seen as the root cause of the rebellion because the first Opium War, its treaty, was the first one that set up a system of just unfair, foreign favoring practices and laws in China, um, including one which just straight up stated that Chinese law does not apply to foreigners who are in China, meaning that if Chinese law says it's illegal to do something and a white person does it, they get to do that thing to you. And if you try to stop them, they get to hurt you because you're breaking their treaty. How dare you lay hand on me? I was just robbing you.
Yeah, in the treaty it says I'm allowed to.
Yep. And this happens economically, legally, religiously, culturally, anything that is naturally Chinese is put on this second class citizen status to anything that is Western. And being told that your country, culture, and ethnicity is innately inferior and you should scrape and bow to a bunch of people who behave in your eyes like uncouth savages would rightfully piss anyone off.
That pisses me off, and I ain't even evolved.
And because of this, they're also interested, aside from just kicking out all the Westerners, in overthrowing the Chinese government, whose ineffectiveness at stopping the West and whose willingness to codify these very discriminatory practices into law is seen as such an innate failure that the only way to restore China and get rid of the Westerners is to overthrow the reigning Qing dynasty and replace it with literally anything else that might work. You know, China is carved into all these spheres of influence under the Western powers. There's all these treaties that the Qing dynasties had to sign, usually with a gun to their head, after losing war after war after war to try and stop it. The Qing have just proven themselves to be an ineffective military force. And, you know, people tend to rise up against those, regardless of how economically and socially bad they are.
it,
And
it's just interesting to see how it all shakes out and how, you know, series of oppression and repression tends to lead out.
yep. To make matters worse, there's a recession in China right before the turn of the 20th century. There's a large scale impoverishment as traditional Chinese ways of life and traditional Chinese culture and businesses and economic systems are being pushed out in favor of this sort of money drain to the West, where the Westerners come in and just take everything. And to top it all off, there's a series of natural disasters during this time frame, which not only add to the impoverishment and general misery of things, but are also seen as, you know, divine proof that the Qing dynasty has lost its mandate from heaven to rule China, seeing as how they kind of frickin' don't. And so the Boxers are very quick to turn on their own government and basically have the goal of, we're going to overthrow the Qing, we're going to turn on the West, and we're going to drive out the Americans, the Russians, the British, the French, the Japanese, the Germans, the Italians. We're going to drive them all out. Very lofty ideological goals. Not particularly realistic. And that's when some cooler heads start to prevail, because the Qing dynasty is very quick to co-opt the Boxers for themselves. The Qing desperately are clinging on to power right here. This is a dynasty in its dying days, and they know it. And so they see this military force that technically isn't associated with them, but also hates almost all the same people they do. And they think, hey, buddy, what if we helped you get rid of some of those foreign people you hate so much?
It happens a lot, though. You see that in so many different societies and cultures where either a dynasty in power or one that is failing gather roots with a grassroots organization, and they find a common ground and a common enemy, and they basically co-opt them into their revolution. I mean, uh, one of the key ones I think about is the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution, which was almost contemporaneous with this, quite frankly. I mean, it was,
Yeah,
what, 17 years after the fact?
Yeah, about a decade or so later.
This kind of behavior is not uncommon, especially if it's a populist movement. You see a lot of populist movements be adapted and be basically intercepted by the government organization who says, hey, this is really powerful, this is really strong. What can we do to benefit this ourselves? And that's really what it boils down to at the end of the day, is how do we as a group benefit from this more so than anyone else?
Yep. And the governor of Shandong province takes the initiative in 1898, where he recruits the Boxers to serve not as this secret society dedicated to overthrowing basically every major government on Earth, but instead as protectors of his province and its Chinese way of life. He gives them official titles. He makes them the militia. They're not the official army. They're not on his payroll. But like the American Minutemen, these are noble and patriotic citizens who, at a moment's notice, will surely rise to the and oh god, they're murdering the Christians.
Why, oh, why, oh, why, oh, why does it also happen to sound like the brown shirts?
Yeah, because it basically is. At this point, uh, the Boxers have their biggest populist support in northern China, and so a lot of governors in those areas follow Shandong's lead. They make them militia, they make them semi-official. They then don't have to worry about all the violence of the Boxers being directed towards themselves, and the Boxers are more than happy to take the pointy sticks that these people are giving them and point them at all the white dudes.
Why don't you
And
just take those pointy little sticks and point them at them?
yeah. What's more, a number of Qing officials also begin to convert to the Boxer mysticism. The Boxers believe that a number of their kung fu rituals granted them magical powers, such as immunity from bullets, which
Ooh.
given that that is the number one cause of death uh, in a war with a Western power, is very useful. The Western powers, for their part, see this, and they write to the Empress of China, going, "Control these people." And the Empress of China looks at it, goes, "That's not a government organization. I'm not involved in that," and just sort of green lights
Yeah,
everything that happens afterwards.
God, it's that whole conflation of I'm not the one in charge of them.
Yeah, it's all the attack ads you see during American elections that are paid for by this super PAC or this foundation. You know, the politicians themselves running. So, oh, I don't agree with calling you X, Y, and Z, even though it's probably true.
Paid for
But
by this person for
I don't.
Congress.
But I don't. I don't control them. They're a private donor organization. Who believe in what I'm doing and are acting on behalf of those ideals, not on behalf of me. Even though they absolutely freaking do coordinate everything together.
Of course, why wouldn't they?
Yeah. So it's kind of like that. It's a cop out, and the Dowager Empress Sixie, I know I can't say her name, gives her support, and she just sits back and she watches the Boxers run with it right off a goddamn cliff, because it turns out angry mob of starving peasants, not particularly strategic.
I don't want to be that kind of guy, but who could have predicted that?
Yep. Now, it doesn't help that the Christian missionaries who are roaming China under this total immunity bullshit kind of go out of their way to piss the Boxers off on a few occasions in 1899 and 1900. And they the Christian missionaries, what they're doing to that angers the Boxers so much is they're using the influence of their Christian dominated home countries of the Western powers to force local governments to side with them and to side with Christian converts who are Chinese over any sort of existing legal precedent or law that happens that happens to exist.
Oh yes.
So what effectively happens is, for a lot of inheritance and property disputes, the Christian converts will go to the Chinese missionary and saying, they're trying to give my family farm to my older brother, who is the rightful heir, but he is a heathen. Will you not go to the government and argue on my behalf? And the Christian missionary comes in and goes, "Hey, man, nice province you got here. Would be a shame if someone had to open it to trade." And suddenly that convert jumps the line of succession and gets all the property.
It's so much strong arm, and this was a really big period of time, especially leading up to the First World War, where imperialism really ran rampant in colonialism. And by this point, the colonial powers kind of realized, hey, we can beat up and we can take really good advantage of all these small, impoverished areas with almost little to no recourse. And that's exactly what they were doing, was they were flexing that muscle. I mean, you had a coalition of European and Western nations fight against China in the First and Second Opium Wars. America even got involved, even though we really didn't have a horse in that race. We had just got done fighting a war with Britain 20 years earlier, and we're just like, yeah, all right, we'll join you.
Yep. Yeah. And that's called it's a big FOMO thing with the Western powers. If you're not in on carving up these other nations, then you're going to be left behind. And if you're left behind, it's only a matter of time before it's your turn on the chopping block. And that's also what gets Japan involved in a lot of this shit too. is Japan sees what keeps happening to everyone else. They see Matthew Perry coming over the horizon. They're like, oh fuck.
Not to mention Matthew Perry's 21 gun salute.
Yeah. But with the Boxers in 1899, they begin to openly attack Christian missionaries and Christian converts on the road. And this causes, big hubbub. Everyone's like, "Oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. Atrocities, people are suffering." And their response is to double down on the missionaryism, which leads to, by May of 1900, the Boxers just encircle Beijing, which at the time is known as the city of Peking. And
Peking.
Yeah, Peking, yep. And
Peking like a bird.
They're basically surrounded their own city. And this is when the official Boxer Rebellion begins, because it is the fight for control of Peking for Beijing here that defines this revolution.
Which what also should tell you is how the West really believed in the strength of this army. Is despite China having a vastly larger population, even at this point, than most Western nations, the Western allies came together and produced 2,100 troops to try and deal with the uprising.
Yep. Now, they are turned back by Imperial Chinese forces on the orders of the Dowager Empress. And she says she gets to do this not because she's supporting this rebellion. No, it's a terrible thing. This peasant uprising that's killing all these people that I hate that look like you. She's able to do this because the army is marching over land. And Chinese land is still Chinese land. And you cannot move a foreign military force through Chinese land. You have to use the water. Because the British invaded with boats. And so a lot of their shit involved opening of access via rivers, not via the roads. So get your ass back to the garrison.
Like the Yangtze River.
Yeah. Now, the response to this is the 2,100 soldiers go back to Tianjin, where the garrison is, and they decide that, okay, if we have to go along the coast, then we're going to be the only thing on the coast. And they seize the Dagu forts, which are the coastal defensive fortifications for the city of Beijing. They just sack those and take them for themselves.
Of course, because we are under threat, so we're going to lay siege to it as well.
Yeah. And along the way, they create a naval route to Beijing using these fortresses. And basically, they guarantee that there is no means for a Chinese military force to intercept anything heading from Tianjin to Beijing. Because any military force there can't claim to be a local garrison. It would have to be brought in from somewhere else in China, which will take too long to stop us. At this point, unfortunately for the Western powers, the Boxers have gotten into Beijing. They've taken the city. And they're instituting a mass purge. Anyone believed to have been tainted by Westernness is murdered. They are particularly targeting Christian converts. But really, anyone seen in Western clothes or who speaks a Western language or who is known to do business with a Western person is on the chopping block.
I get it from an outsider perspective of like you're trying to preserve your way of life. You're trying to preserve your life, the way you know, your culture, your traditions, especially because these Europeans will come in and mandate change with every little thing. But to go around and straight up murk everyone you come across is a really bold strategy.
Yeah, this is full on Warsaw Ghetto levels of purge going on here. uh, as they are just murdering for days. And the Empress um, decides to back that.
Well,
On June 18th, word has reached her of what the Western armies have done, which is declare war on China through the seizure of Chinese military installations. And so she responds with, if they're going to invade us again, we might as well go all in for a penny, in for a pound. And she declares that all foreigners must expel themselves from China immediately or face the consequences, i.e., be murdered. So she gives an ultimatum of anyone who is not Chinese needs to leave China now or die.
God. It's one of those things of like I'm sure she turned her head away at a lot of the stuff they were doing for that exact reason of like, okay, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of deal.
Yeah.
Like we both
And
hate the same goals. We may have some disagreements in terms of beliefs, but we think that these European guys are quite bad, and that's exactly how they would proceed.
yeah, and the grand strategy for the Dowager Empress is relatively simple. Let the Boxers and the Western powers deal with each other. If the Boxers win, great. We've gotten rid of the Western powers, which are the bigger threat. And we can go around and demonize the Boxers as, you know, genocidal maniacs
Yeah,
because they went around and
warmongers.
murdered so many of our own population. They're not a legitimate form of government. They're not a legitimate Chinese force. They're monsters, and turn opinion against them and crush them. If the Western powers win, well, they're going to be overextended and hopefully in a weakened state that the Chinese government might be able to take some advantage of it and reclaim some small part of its dignity and sovereignty. But really, this game works best if the Boxers win, which is why she's backing them more and more as time goes on, as opposed to helping the Western powers.
Yeah, she basically just played the long con on it all and like tried to pre-position herself to where no matter what the outcome was, she could succeed. And I understand that from a preservation standpoint, especially within the Qing dynasty, which had quite literally existed for millennia, almost because of that positioning, because of that power. They really excelled at being able to navigate that dynamic and to, you know,
Yeah.
as much as I hate to use the name of the show as a truth, but there really is this Game of Thrones.
Yeah. And the thing with the Qing is they have been on this throne for almost 3 centuries at this point. They have known they have been in decline for the last 6 decades. So there is no back my friends or commit to a cause. There is only surviving till tomorrow.
And it's interesting too when you look contemporaneously at the exact same time, because at the time that the Boxer Rebellion is going on, the first Russo-Japanese War is really in full effect. I mean, if not shortly thereafter, where Japan
Yeah.
had been extremely rapidly westernized and they became this overly militant power and had gotten into all these conflicts because of their imperialistic expansionist
Yeah.
ideas.
So the Russo-Japanese War is going to come about in part as a result of this rebellion,
Oh God, okay.
uh, because Japan and Russia are two of the Western Power Coalition members being sent to put down this uprising. So
Oh,
they are working together here, which is absolutely hilarious given how much the Tsar of Russia and the Emperor of Japan hate each other.
and that's only going to set the stage for the Second World War even more.
Yeah. Um, but at this point, the Boxers murder the German minister, and the remaining delegates and Christians fortify themselves in the legation quarters and a Roman Catholic cathedral and issue over the wire an international call for aid. And in response to this, the Southern and Yangtze River-based imperial officials move to quell the uprising. They're going out of the way to say, this is not state-sponsored. The government is not involved. This is a revolt against us as much as it is against you. Doesn't matter what the Empress is saying. These people want us all dead.
Smile, smile, wink, wink.
Yeah. And this is very useful insurance for the Empress should the Boxers lose, because if they lose, she needs something to go with the whole. Well, when I said everyone get out or die, I wasn't threatening them with die. I was saying get out before these monsters kill you. Why
Yeah, I
can't you
was
read
warning.
Chinese?
I was
Yeah.
warning them.
I mean, your German minister died because he wouldn't heed my warning. It's not my fault your translator sucks.
So many
I don't speak
conflicts.
good English.
So many conflicts could have been avoided with better translators.
Yeah. And a coalition of 8 nations arise to suppress the Boxers. You have Russia and Japan, like we mentioned before, Britain and the United States. You have Austria-Hungary. You have France. You have Germany, and you have Italy, also known as everyone who is going to kill each other in 20 years.
Crazy how that works out.
The only person not involved in this who is majorly involved in World War One is the Ottomans. Literally, the roster for World War One is just you switch Japan with the Ottomans and you've got it.
I mean, the Ottomans were just in it for the love of the game at that point.
Yep. That's because the Ottomans did not care about China. So they're not involved in this. And this is, ironically, one of the first instances of like true international global cooperation is murdering a Chinese peasant revolt.
God, if there's one thing that would heal the world, I think I know what it is.
Yeah. Now, an army of 19,000 troops is raised by this coalition to retake Beijing. And they sack and loot the city on August 14th.
Of course they do, because what is war without sacking?
Yep. It had been less than 2 months since the Boxers took Beijing on June 20th. And they really do have a combination of military strategies, because the Americans decide that the best way to get into the city is to set up artillery and fire on it.
And American war strategy has not changed in 100 years.
And so, so the Americans just blast the city walls apart.
So anyways, I start blasting.
And then they get into the city, and they turn their cannons to the gates of the Imperial City, blast that open, get further in, get to the Forbidden City where the Empress lives, blast those. They don't knock. They just start shooting cannonballs anytime they see a wall.
I mean, I can imagine it's like one of those Russian nesting dolls, but with just gates and walled cities. It's like, God damn it, another one? Well, fire ahead. We've hit another gate.
They just keep doing that. And that's just the Americans the whole way through, is they just keep opening all the walls, and then everyone else runs through. And so they then decide that, they're going to do what they do later in World War II, which is, now that we've conquered this place, we're going to divide it up into districts where each nation gets to govern a district of the city. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say govern? I meant loot, pillage, burn, and murder.
Again, some things just never change. I mean, 50 years later, they employed the same tactic, and we see where that led us.
Yep. And so, mass executions during this time period are not uncommon. You wandered into the German, you just happened to live in the German quarter. Well, the German minister is the one that was brutally murdered. So guess what's happening to you? That man looks Asian. He must be a boxer. Kill him.
Yikes.
That child looks Asian. He must be a boxer. Kill him. That old woman. Boxer. Kill her.
This other guy. He's fine. Let him through.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this coalition is how much everyone in it hated each other. Because the coalition originally agreed to come together under the German Field Marshal Alfred von Waldersee, because the Germans are by far the most militaristic of the European powers at this point. They have arisen out of Prussia, and they have a history of just having military be their sole fucking identity. So everyone agrees that these hyper militant, landlocked assholes are going to lead. Except Waldersee is detained in Germany, and he can't logistically join up with the force he's supposed to lead. So the British decide that their own Lieutenant General, Sir Alfred Gassely, of the British Indian Army, is the next highest ranking officer and therefore should replace him. Except he's not. See, the second in command for this army, the second highest ranking officer assigned to it, was Japanese General Yamaguchi Motomi. And the other 7 powers of this 8-nation coalition all veto his ascension to being the number 1 officer on the grounds that he is Asian and everyone else there is white.
Again, not a great track record, but when you bring too many Europeans together in one area, it's not a great thing. And
you wonder why Japan kind of hates everyone for the first half of the 20th century. Because they're being told that your officer is outranked by a lower ranking officer from another country based on quite literally his ethnicity. What message does that send back to Japan? We got to beat the shit out of these fuckers before they respect us. Hey, Russia, that's a nice island you got there.
The Japanese and Kuril Islands. What a story.
Yeah. Now, this army just bulldozes the Chinese Imperial Army at Tianjin, Baikang, and Yangon, because the Japanese Imperial Army is desperately trying to keep this force out of Beijing long enough for the Boxers to actually break into the legation. Because if the legation ministers are able to be held hostage, this army will stand down. If this army gets to Beijing before that happens, the Empress knows she's lost. And this army gets to Beijing before that happens because the Chinese army is fighting them with crossbows and spears.
Ooh.
And every single member of the coalition is fighting in post-Napoleonic rifle formations, meaning they outrange you and can penetrate your armor with massive, massive walls of firing.
But let's not forget, the version of Kung Fu allows them to be immune to bullets.
Unfortunately, not. However, Oof. God has some other plans. As this coalition force of 19,000 troops that sacks Beijing loses 9,000 men to exhaustion, sunstroke, and disease, because it turns out having a forced march where no one speaks the same language kind of fucks everything up. So they do lose half their numbers because they didn't plan for shit.
That's such a large amount of troops lost over just pure incompetence, though, to be fair.
Yeah. Now, many of these troops don't die, they recover, but they have to be left behind in Dagu forts, in field hospitals, and other places. The army just kind of leaves them on the roadside to pick up your shit and catch up with us or die.
Well, yeah, I mean, while they may not have died, they're no use to the army, and when you're fighting a war and putting down a rebellion, every troop really matters.
Yep. Yeah. Now, it takes 55 days for the relief force to reach Beijing and break in. And the defense of the legation quarters and the Roman Catholic Church gets highly romanticized under the title The 55 Days at Peking. There's a whole song dedicated to it that's like the song of, the song of a dozen nations, where it's just, you know, each different army has its own verse and its own language, singing about, the wicked Chinese coming to Beijing and trying to murder everyone, and how we marched down there and for 55 days beat them back. And there's even been a 1963 film called 55 Days at Peking that very much takes the side of the legation in this as civilized people being put under, siege by brutes and monsters, bloodthirsty fiends. Like the story, it demonizes the hell out of the Chinese.
Well, it always does. What's the famous Winston Churchill quote? History shall be kind to me, for I intend to write it. Like, the
Yeah.
victor always writes the history. And in this case, when you put a bunch of peasants and farmers with sticks and spears up against a rifle corps,
Yeah.
the math just doesn't work out the greatest.
Yeah. Now, the British get the added bit of claiming the glory of being a group that seized the legation, that liberated it, because all the nations are racing each other to get there first. Because whoever gets to the legation first gets to be the nation that saved all China. And the British get there first because the Boxers write off the British as too slow to do anything, and instead divert the full bulk of their strength at the Americans and the Russians, both of which are moving lightning fast. The Americans, carrying the fucking artillery, are outplacing the British infantry.
Which really goes to show that the Second World War, just some 40 years later, really had the groundworks, because you had very similar of American and Russian troops converging on one point, while the British are just dilly dallying their way through the.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason the Americans are so fast with the damn artillery is they learned from this little thing called the Civil War about popping up into a fortified place, smashing it, and moving forward. They learned momentum is key.
Not to mention, at this point, they had just got done fighting the Spanish-American War, where they had got done fighting a massive colonial power and would take down their fortifications using heavy artillery.
Yep. Yeah. The Americans learned that if you can move a big enough gun into place fast enough, nothing can stop you.
Yeah, the Americans, all they really learned was more gunpowder, bigger boom, larger effect.
Yeah.
You just know some country bumpkin was like, what if we poured in 4 times the amount of gunpowder and put a twice as heavy slug in there?
Yeah.
They were
Meanwhile,
just
the Russians are able to move so fast because only one man has a gun and only one man has bullets. Oh, no, wait, that was Stalingrad.
I mean, that effectively, the Russians always played that game of like next man up in line, and it very much was, the unstoppable Russian machine. That's part of where they get the nickname from.
Yep. Yep. Now, the Empress and her court managed to get out of Beijing before the Americans blow through all the doors they need to get to her. And they flee to Xi'an. And she leaves behind a couple of princes and government officials to conduct negotiations on her behalf, because if this goes wrong and the Western powers are angry, fun fact they are, then having the Empress elsewhere will mean that China is not forced to accept whatever terms are presented to them and can carry on whatever fight is going to happen.
Well, and to a degree, it also shows like, look, we were so scared, we also had to flee.
Yeah, that too. Now, negotiations take a while, and in September of 1901, there's a protocol signed to officially end hostilities between the Western powers, the Boxers, and the Qing government, which means that up until September, it was rules of war, meaning that within your sector, you could do whatever you wanted to that population because the Geneva Convention doesn't exist yet. And this is, as the British are very skilled at doing, a punitive raid. So, hello, atrocities. now, at now the terms of this are pretty one-sided. China stands down its armies, stands down what's left of the Boxers, and pays reparations to the Western powers, a total of some $330 million. Now, the U.S. remits this money. They say, we didn't come here to get paid by you. So instead, what they do is they say, we'll return this, our portion of this money if you use it to build a university in Beijing and educate your people better in a Western style, which China accepts. Now, most of the other Western powers do eventually remit their shares, just much, much later than the US does. As this is, the actions taken in Beijing at this time are generally viewed as wrong by the modern lens.
Well, yeah, it's just the idea of conquering a people like this and then just taking as much money from them as you could. And we don't really truly learn the lesson about reparations until the end of the First World War into the Second, when it really comes back to bite them in the ass. But realistically, the same has been said about China, where China, in turn, could have become a good European ally had instead developed this animosity towards them, because when you make them pay a punitive damage for a war that peasants caused, that weren't even like your military, wasn't even your own armed forces, that doesn't exactly leave a good opinion in the mouths of the population.
Yeah. Yeah. Our population has been massacred, our cities leveled, our sacred capital desecrated, and now we have to pay you because a group of people got so mad about having to pay you for other shit that we didn't even really do.
Not to mention the whole reason the tensions boiled over were you were exerting your own presence in our homeland to such a large degree that it led to an armed uprising.
Yeah. Yeah. You forced this, and then you're blaming us for it. And no one likes that. Additionally, as per this protocol, foreign troops from the different powers were to be stationed directly in Beijing, the capital of China, just, outside the litigation quarters and the Forbidden City and the Imperial City, basically anywhere where it would be really convenient for either the Chinese to take hostages or for the Western powers to take hostages. Additionally, all Chinese fortifications in and around Beijing must be destroyed and leveled. And as a result of this, the weakness shown by by this treaty is kind of the cause of the fall of the Qing dynasty just a decade later in 1911, which ends 300 years of Qing rule. This time in 1911, the rebellion goes directly for the Qing government. It doesn't bother with the foreigners. It just straight up says, you can't rule us. You're incompetent. Get out.
Yeah, when your government collapses so efficiently and so effectively that you basically get left paying the bill for a war that other nations caused on your behalf, it really doesn't leave a great opinion in the mouths of the citizens and civilians.
Yeah, because the lesson that that the Chinese should have taken away 60 years ago, that the Qing refused to do when the First Opium War ended, was effectively modernize, militarize, and industrialize. And they did none of those things. So 60 years after learning that a massive land army armed with spears cannot defeat a vastly numerically superior army with guns, the Chinese government still employs 0 guns.
I
That level of willful ignorance was just, the Chinese people refused to tolerate it.
I do understand it to a degree, though, where there's a certain level of not wanting to adopt these technologies out of fear of over westernizing. Like, let's talk about just the fact that both China and Japan wanted to be isolated nations because they knew the effect that having these western powers had. They could see their neighbors and how decimated they got, and instead wanted to try to preserve their culture, their people, their language, and in doing so ended up catching the ire of these western nations that had depleted the resources in almost every other neck of the woods. You know, you saw these nations come in, and the biggest issue I have with European colonialization was it was overly extractive. They would go in, they would take what they want, pumped out all the resources they needed, and they would leave a shell behind. It was never mutually beneficial. It was never to help both sides like a good trade route would be, and instead of trying to negotiate an equal trade, they overly used force to get their own way.
Yeah, but at the same, at the same time, with like the difference between China and Japan in that is Japan had people who, would get a hold of the reins of government, who saw the value of firearms and modernizing and militarizing. You have Oda Nobunaga. You have was it Mutsuhito Meiji? You have these people who see guns and industry and realize that tools are what cultures use to maintain dominant positions, and they adopt them. You have the end of the 100-year civil war in Japan with Oda Nobunaga. You have the Meiji Restoration with Mutsuhito Meiji.
But
You
instead,
have
you see
you
over
you don't have that with the Qing. You don't have an effort to bring in the technologies that can benefit them.
and instead you see over 100,000 people dead, which were
Yep.
mostly civilians and almost all Chinese. Of that number, 250 were foreign nationals, 3,000 soldiers, mostly Chinese military, were dead, and it also left 96,750 civilians dead. This wasn't
Yep.
like the collateral damage. This wasn't like the tragedies of war. No, this is downright murder and slaughter and
Yep.
just
I
an
mean,
outright exercise of power.
yeah, it's reprisals. It's the boxers enacting reprisals against westernized Chinese in Beijing. It's the Western powers enacting reprisals against boxers and traditional Chinese in Beijing. It's very little of it is actually militant fighting, and most of it is just street massacres by both sides.
It's just it got to such a point where I don't think it necessarily needed to be, where it just became an outright punitive measure. It was not how can we punish them, it's how far can we go with the punishment.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about it very briefly here, but I think for the last couple of minutes of this episode, we just talk about the cultural impact this had because this was right at the turn of the century. We start
Yep.
seeing revolutions pop up all over the place. I mean, we see another one in China a decade later with the Qing dynasty. You already mentioned the Meiji Restoration, where we see Japan switch to a more Western industrial focus, where they become militarized. You see the Russian Revolution just a few months or couple of years later as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
This
this
is
really had long-term cultural impacts.
this also really sets up the Russians and the Japanese for the Russo-Japanese War, because both of them kind of realize with this that, oh shit, they're competing for the same tracts of land, because they both kind of realize, wait, you want Manchuria? And that does not go over well with either of them.
It's really interesting, and you mentioned the coalition governments forming the basis of World War One, and that is accurate. But this is also arguably one of the first times that you see a truly global response to conflict, and it's something that really comes into play. And it's interesting because this was preceded by the first Sino-Japanese War, which saw the Japanese and Chinese fight against over Korea, which was occupied, two colonial powers. But you see this coalition, this world power, come together to fight these wars. It was no longer this isolated incident, and there has not been a single war since. This was the first modern war, in my opinion, because of the coalitions and groups that were involved.
Yeah, it's very much testing out the waters of the alliance system that is going to collapse in 1914 and lead to World War One. It's very much, and that Sino-Japanese War that you mentioned. That's the tail end of the Meiji Restoration, and Japan proving that, yes, we're a power too. We're not something to be opened. We're something that opens other countries, and trying to create its own little empire, because let's be honest, Japan has really had a lot of time desiring territory over there for a lot of its history.
Well, and once Japan started industrializing like the rest of the world, they realized that they had very limited resources on the island. The island
Yep.
was great for food, but in terms of like natural resources, it was severely lacking. But hey, guess what Manchuria has? Guess what the Korean Peninsula has? Guess what China had a lot of?
Yeah. They have resources, and resources to be taken. And,
It just it
that's kind of what everyone's mentality is in this war with the Boxer Rebellion is hurry up and take as much as you can, because if you don't, you'll be left behind. And from the Boxer perspective, get off me, you parasites.
yeah, and the the other thing I think is interesting here is this was kind of that intermission between the American, French, Irish rebellions of the late 17th, early 18th centuries, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think my time frame is
Yeah.
right, or late
Uh,
18th, early 19th centuries, where you have these populist revolts against these oppressive powers, and it's interesting just how it took a little bit longer. It was more delayed in Eastern Asia, but just how much of a different approach they took with their different beliefs and with their different systems. I mean, you saw all out warfare with other groups in their rebellions. This one wasn't quite that. Like you said, the Qings kind of bent backwards a little bit, kind of went hands off. But then also, by the time it was too late, they tried backpedaling, and it just did not have any effect.
yeah. The Qing's goal was to be a bureaucratic nuisance to the Western powers, to the point that hopefully the Boxers could get something done that would convince the Western powers to maybe not go full military with it. And unfortunately, the Boxers just kept provoking the military.
And it got overly military, and that's what led us to this event.
Yeah, and if the Boxers had gotten into the foreign legation, they might, if they had been smart, been able to take hostage most of the high-ranking ministers of these other powers. But in all honesty, the Boxers weren't smart with that, because if they had, they would have abducted the German minister instead of murder him in the streets.
Yeah, admittedly, probably not the best move on their part, but I think that's actually probably a great point for us to wrap a bow on this here episode.
Yeah.
You know, let us know your thoughts down below. Let us know your opinions. Thank you guys for your patience while we work through the backlog here. It has been a wild couple of weeks. Be sure to listen to our previous episode about H.H. Holmes. And Colum, do you want to give them a just little bit of a sneak preview as to what is in store with the next episode?
Yes, we are doing a history of the city of everyone's favorite Incan emperor, Cusco. Is he a
Cusco.
llama? Is he a man? Who knows? So be sure to bring your Spanish pups for that one. And see you next time.
Thank you guys for watching. We'll catch you later.